Do Shi Ni De Gen Tari San Ye Shi Do Mi Te O I Do Ku Nam Da Shi La Chu Parashu Guru Rana Mandala Ganiya Tayami Sanji Chedan Tsojin Chonung La Changju Pardu Dani Kyabsun Chi Dagi Chushi Jibin Tsonung Cholan Penshi Sanji Druparashu Sanji Chedan Tsojin Chonung La Changju Pardu Dani Kyabsun Chi Dagi Chushi Jibin Tsonung Ji Cholan Penshi Sanji Druparashu Sanji Chedan Tsojin Chonung La Chanchu Bardu Dani Kyabsun Dagi Chushi Yibin Tsonung Jin Cholan Ben Sanji Druparashu Kanki Tuzi Nizone Dawa Tamche Pambi Chere Tambi Chun Tenzi Pi Kodam Kela Changze Lo
Oh,
Good morning everyone.
Mama La
San Ge Lama Chu De Shi Lama Gen Den De Kun Ji Je Bo Lama Lama Nam La Bar Pi 다 가진 안저 가진 참디 다주 다 레비제비 나몰이야 다 잔주 샘 공당 다 조디 송고도 아스라 딘자다 다지단 슈고 말다 먼저 다 대버 침비고 추고다 님부디 잔주 샘 아니 다 잔주 샘 공부 제발이야 네버드더니 닌지 침부 공고요 봐 인지려야다 주민의 용어 통고야 된지 그래도 아주 저다 전주 샘 기발이야 인지 침불이야 주마마이 용어 통고야 인지 침불이야 주마마이 용어 통하기 시자 조디 되면은 윤대명아 된거는 로장주 그런바디 약부 되면은 다시 냠지고는 로장주 그런바 딩이 강로 지메나 아니 인지 침불이야 주마마이 용어 통세디 자원인 메시바지 딘자 아니 딘자다 만주 까법기 dakshi nyamji gon lo jangsulti dakshi nyamba imba di ngonne thani gi samlo shibsa tanggoya yang de samlo tanggoya di theba chimbi gu chu gu pigi shitsa thatuba chagi yobati ngon jinggoya di pekhi chimbu insares ro.
In studying the 8th chapter from Shantideva's Guide to Bodhisattva of Life, the main subject matter of this topic is Bodhichitta, the mind of enlightenment, which is also the essence of the Mahayana Dharma. So in order then to train in Bodhichitta, the mind of enlightenment, we need great compassion. not only we need great compassion, we need it to be uncontrived great compassion. That is the basis for developing bodhicitta. So then, since we need great compassion, what we train it is the sevenfold cause and effect personal instructions, or equalizing and exchanging self with others. Without using any of these two techniques, the man of enlightenment will not arise. It is impossible to develop bodhicitta without relying upon any of those two systems. So here we're studying equalizing and exchanging self with others, and we begin with equalizing self with others. So we need to understand the reasons and rationale in applying this technique in great details. We need to do it. We need to not only think of the reasons for equalizing self with others in great details, we need to do it again and again in order to form the basis for the development of the Mahayana Dharma. And it's important to recognize that this is the basis for the Mahayana Dharma.
추 제기열에 추 제고래 추 제디 야부베레 이네 추 남다 제고야 돼. 아니 추 약슈디 제고야다. 디다 기치지로다 추 약슈디 아니 대버진부추. 대버진부추스라나 심전 탐지기 된 삼에디 디레도서 대버진부추스야디 심전 탐지기 된 삼에디. 비기다 랑제번 진 야부투비 로디 다 더작 조디 아니 디샤니 아니 심전 탐지 제번진비 로 용예라야 진진 로 용예라야 아니 즉 다신냠바 로 다신냠비 상로디 당간주 남긴데 베나다 즉 몰람도 지압 덴바틴데 데메칼야 다신냠지 로 야부지 용예 쇼세기 몰람디치다 개우무다스로 원니 제와나 다신냠지 로도 빼마스 케신 보라 다신냠바지 하마고 바이나 랑리 현자치 로세디 용야 자원이 매겨지래도서라 딘자 감디 아니 자스심 셔발레겠다 다진냠바 인수디 베지부 망부토니 아니 시우진 송고도 딘자 텔네데 진 상로다니 원네 다든신 냠바레도 삼송기다 지 니시 많이 바르도 상로단 투바나 원네 대바침비게 아니 자와지 축조고 요사레스라.
So we practice the Mahayana. We want to practice the Mahayana. We need to practice the Mahayana. It's a good practice to practice the Mahayana. We have different ways of referring to this practice, and often we also refer to the practice of the Mahayana to be often we also refer to the practice of the Mahayana to be a good practice or the best practice. So if you think about it like that, then we need then to think of the welfare of all sentient beings, the benefit of all sentient beings. And if we think of the welfare or the benefit of all sentient beings, we need to address our self-cherishing attitude. So currently we cherish ourselves more than we cherish others. We cherish ourselves and we neglect other living beings. So we first of all need to address our degree of self-cherishing. In order to do that, we first of all begin with equalizing self with others. So thinking of the daily practice that we have, we make different aspirations in our daily practice. But Geshe is wondering if we make aspirational prayers for equalizing self with others. It is likely that it's quite rare to find someone that prays, may I be able to equalize self with others. But it is so important for a practice to be able to equalize self with others, because without equalizing self with others, it will be not possible to develop the exchange of self with others that will form the basis for the development of bodhicitta. And therefore, here Shantideva explains the way to equalize self with others using many reasons. And we need to think of those reasons to not only study them, but to think about them again and again until we find certainty in the equality of self and others, so that will form the basis for the Mahayana practice of equalizing, exchanging self with others as a way of developing bodhicitta.
There is a lot of things Benata Tevachim Chip, Junju Yamsling is in by now. Junju Gasim Shawal Sombi, Junju Yamsling is in by now. That Darshin Yamji, Lord Jansudi, Chanju Sem Jonsu, Tabchi Manga, Kicheshudi, Junju Nala, the song does. Things that dang on the Dardan Shen Yamba in Tolaya, and the Gasim Shawalita, Riba Jatamon, but Tanshabati, but some chick the Nichin Bank, never chinra. And Riba countries Tangiome, Ginsen countries Guiome, but chick the never chinny, and Darshin Yamba in Bachik, and same thing near to by now. Da and Jean Jebanzin, Shen Yaw Torsadi, a load tending go to Sares, Ra. Cousin Yamba in Bati, Chickba in Bahakwana, and Chickbata the Yungros. Tini and Samni, Combanibalaya, da Rang Slavandi, Michigla 2 Yabata, Shen Slavandi, begin maybe Simjan Tamjela 2 day of Tintich Tondi, and Rangli Shen Jeban Zimbi, losing in the Yacha Yatama Yunguyosaris.
So when we practice the Mahayana Dhamma, or if we practice the Mahayana Dhamma, or here we practice Shantideva's Guide to Bodhisattva way of life, and therefore of the most important things for us to practice is equalizing and exchanging self with others. The instructions on equalizing and exchanging self with others. And here Shantideva presents hundreds of reasonings for equalizing self with others. So whatever reasoning Shantideva posits, a multitude of reasonings that he posits here, we use them in order to create an attitude in which we consider self and others as equal, to the point in which when we gain certainty, great confidence in the equality of self and others, we then become capable of putting a stop to our self-cherishing attitude. So amongst the reasoning that we use is for equalizing self with others is we recognize that I am just one individual and I depend upon others, and others are many, a great number of beings that are included within the others, and I depend upon them. So if we think about such reasoning, we can certainly come to the point in which we put a stop to our own self-cherishing attitude.
아니 다 랑기 동을 세고 여봐 나신기 젠기 동을 세고 그랬어 다 어디래 진짜 디기다 아니 세고 고바디 야지 계시기 독바로디 케이크 세번 세티 니바 디 케이크 세번 세 딘로지라스 가디 델 동하베 달면 칠무송 마음바이 동하야 넘치는 대체송스
So going back to the text, picking up from the point that we left off yesterday, first of all, let's look at the outline. So we're going to pick up today from verse 97, but we're looking at explaining the reasons why it is reasonable to meditate on the equation, such an equation of equalizing self with others. In looking at extensive explanation, we stated the reason. Now we're going to establish, now we're establishing the pervasion. Yesterday, we looked at the actual established pervasion, and today we're going to look at dispelling hindrances or objections to that, beginning with verse 97. So, verse 97 reads, first of all, an objection. I do not protect them because their suffering does not cause me harm. The response, then why protect myself against future suffering if it causes me no harm?
대다딘 데벨로션데 가디스음젠 델라 둥간 종위에 달라 메네비처 무송 셰나스 데니 체메리디 체메리디 기비치 둥간 종어 토니 쟰비치 노르소바탄 대신도 상단 치료 둥간 종어 토니 대린당 chudru tune dungar sebi tablan beba meriwa tha chimi tuji dungar maumbi dungar yang ngami tuji kanza dela neba mechena ten jong toni chisong song meriwa talos sen dagi chimi dungar gi gyudoba machina chimar dagi dungar nyongube teli dobe tablan beba riksu shenas
I am. Yeah, I'm recording. So the commentary says, beginning with the argument, I do not protect sentient beings when they experience suffering because the suffering does not harm me. To answer that, it says, this is highly unsuitable. Otherwise, it would also be unsuitable to accumulate wealth when young out of fear of suffering in old age, or to engage in the morning, in the day, in a method to avoid suffering in the afternoon or tomorrow, since the latter future suffering does not harm the earlier person. Even if one fears there could be suffering, it would be inappropriate to protect oneself.
terda tug khabar jawa ra ani kewang hashi khabar jawa an tuzuta pigi tsiki shibja de tesi shingo dos ani shogi tug gi medi ani medi gongru tusu pigile yang gado yoras ra sendi khabar de chibi medi 아니 균 깨워치말은 로그르마도 세디 캐버드 집에 미코라 깨워치말은 로다 로수치요 말했어. 진짜 딘딜레 캐버자바나 세디기 미디기 아니 다디 미디기 아니 지 침마 아니 야 동암 문종이 쳐도 아니 베리기 말해스. 가서 다디 미디 아니 고개징 이번엔 가도 그러왔어. 계란 썸 땅다 치와나 딘디 순거라 다로
죄송한데 세디 칸사디
센디 캐버치비 칸사디 개워치말이야 딜라바 있는 욕다로지 착사리.
So then here we're making some distinctions in terms of time, like for example in terms of past and future lives. So the type of argumentation that we use here is considering, for example, the person that we were in the morning. That particular person in the morning has ceased when it is evening time. So looking at the evening, the morning persons, that particular person has ceased. Also thinking about this particular person of this life, in thinking of the transition from this lifetime to the next. When going to the next life, that particular person in this life has ceased. That particular person of this life does not go as they are to next lifetime.
Go through.
So is it confusing? Do you find yourself confused?
Jambu dasra jambu and this nyogda saurochi. Kansan nganzo pena shogi chuzu gebi tugi pena milogie chambadi. 아니 쇼기 추즈 뒤게 밀로게 참바디 다단다 추즈 쭉직 마슨 samlaya 아니 로게의 추즈니 로사죠
로게
로 쇼기 로 답변은 추즈니 체르로 살아다 쇼기 추즈 게비까고 미디
추즈
게비까고 미디 추즈 쭈벌레 온디 아니 다니 쇼기 미디 차고 말았어 가서 추즈추 로사위 미 때스 긴고 차사 이러지
로게 오케이. So it's good that you're not confused. It means that you're smart. But anyway, so Avis is saying that she is confused. I hope that the conclusion is not that you're not smart. Anyway, yeah, you're smart. Avis, I'm just joking. Geshe said that actually this point is confusing. It is complicated. It is difficult because when we think of, for example, 8 o'clock in the morning. So we have the person of 8 o'clock in the morning. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the person has aged. So there has been a process of aging. So the person of 8 o'clock in the morning has ceased in that the process of aging has occurred and changed up until 10 o'clock in the morning.
나니기 pena 나니기 니동 뉴슈 담비기 로기 pena Geshe Tsultrim 롱갑중아직 니동 뉴슈 짜지기 Geshe Tsultrim 롱갑중아니 이제 로직이 켜봐 나니디 차고 말했어 pena 단다디 나니 메디 차고 말했어.
So for example, last year, 2020, there was Geshe Tsultrim of the age of 51. Now in 2021, we have Geshe Tsultrim of the age of 52. So Geshe Tsultrim at the age of 52, Geshe Tsultrim of this year, is not the Geshe Tsultrim of 2020. It's not a 51-year-old Geshe Tsultrim.
딘자다 디니 미직 차마송스 직로 납중아직리 직로 납중아니리 이네 롱납중아직 챵바디게 롱납중아니 갑라야 직 기부 용약이 쳇도 아니 직 소야저라 따라와 어디래 함고 녀야라 소바 어떻서라 아니 제 머리 와타스 아니 제 다제 제 머리 와타스라 아니 머리 와타 캐나 납중아니 갑라야 아니 납중아지 가고디 데메비처 어딘들라고 하더라.
So the 51-year-old Geshe Tsultrim is not the 52-year-old Geshe Tsultrim. They are not the same person. So given that they are not the same person, we here following a certain absurd consequence. And the absurd consequence says that it follows that this 51-year-old person does not need to work in order to take care or establish the welfare of the 52-year-old person. But Geshe says that himself, or he of the age of 51, did a few things in order to make sure that Geshe Tsultrim of the age of 52 will have a comfortable or a good experience or life when it's 52 years old. So then, so for example, looking at the things that might contribute to one's happiness, or well-being, like buying shoes and the like, then the argument that you would put forward here would be that therefore the 51-year-old person does not need to do anything such as buying shoes and so forth in order to take care of the person that will be 52-year-old person.
Tadi tesik jangu dasra pigi ta riglam gutoli tesik jambana and dige kamutelaya and troyores ra troyores ani demado da majambaina ani kamedian kenza dojik chagdosra.
So we need to train in this form of logic. If we train in this form of logic, we'll be able to relish the flavor, the taste of this reasoning. Whereas if you don't make this deliberate effort to train yourself in this type of reasons, it would be, will not become that interested or inspired by using this logical reasoning.
Tangi riglam des jamba inza di ani rigba di yabshu tansha samsung ke chik chona le tuya do di ta riglam des jamba inza di ka den ro sra pesh riglam ma jamba in des khagbo do chik.
But Geshe's training was such that he was trained in logic, and therefore he feels that this line of argumentation that Shantideva puts forward here is really good reasons. But still, if you're not used to that form of logical reasoning, might be a little bit difficult.
다기 때는 용냠비 넘버 똑ten lokpates. The show shenila kewayan shenis.
Let's look at the next verse in the text that presents an objection, that deals with this objection, sorry. Verse 98, and it says, the conceptualization thinking that I shall experience that is wrong. The person who died thus is one, and that reborn is another.
Red Cindy Dagi Chimmy to Dungatin Yambi number Tobatin Shinjilobates Pitachi Cindy Cabertu Machibi touching Hashi Chingzing Tangzin Sach and in Hashi Chigdunzimbi Hama the Chimanyimbodi Pigilaya Chigran Zendiadi Hashi Chingzing Tangzin Sach Chagores T Lodi Lobares Lo Loba T Wangi 아니 지금 함이 되게 미디 아니 침미 뒤스다 비 동아도 용고래 삼비기 아니 삼로디 로바레스 되는 로바데스 아니 시바디 젠레 케와디 젠레스 로가레스 따로 간지.
Let's look at the argument. It says if one would not wonder in this life whether one could experience suffering in the latter life, then one would have to experience suffering in the latter life. It is therefore appropriate to make an effort to prevent this situation. So here we're looking at certain argument that is put forward in order to contest the idea that other suffering does not harm me. So if you look at past and future lifetimes, or the previous person and the latter person, then if one would not wonder in this life whether one could experience suffering in the latter life, then one would have to experience the suffering in the latter life. So if you think that in the future I should not have to experience the suffering created by the person in this life, it is a wrong consciousness. The answer is the conceptual thinking. So the conceptual thought thinking that the self of this life experiences suffering in the latter life is distorted. So if you think that in looking at the transition from this lifetime to the next, if you think that the person in future life will experience the suffering of the person in this life, this is a wrong consciousness.
당아주 미 류질렌체 다 미 텐텔야 아니 지 렌덴다 문다 녀체 로 디본 바시 첸 데바이나 아니 신이 케와 셴디 다 베시 자차 잔 자차 자탐바도치 야 낭송을 케바데 네바로스 다 낭송을 케는 벤 톤로도 케바이나 아니 딘디게 톤로를 케비 톤로 테다 아니 첸데 미 있다려야 랭에버 소딩이 미님보디 아니 깨워 지그레베스나 미지그레베스나 말아왔어 진짜 아니 첸디 캐버드치비 미디기 비기다 아니 둔주기 동아디 뇽기요 말았더라
건데
첸디 캐버드치비 미디.
So then we go on and take another rebirth. We go on and take another body, and that is created through the force of karma, the actions that we take and the result that they bring. So, for example, ourselves in this life, if we only perform negative actions, it is 100% certain that in our future life will, based on the negative actions that we take, we will be born in a miserable state of existence. Like, for example, it depends upon the negative actions in this life, we might be born as an animal. So if we are born as an animal, due to the negative actions that we perform in this life, the animal that we will be in the future, or the animal body that we'll have in the future, will not be experiencing the suffering of the person that we hear in this life. The body of the animal would not be experiencing the suffering of a human being that we are in this life.
Some testana trombu test chagrasra some shuk chembustana ani pe trombu chayach dindi redos in the same di dagi chimi tusu donga den nyong nyambi number to about the shinji lobo de the shibi kansa telama jen nyela kewa chimi kansa te teni shenyi yimbi teni chigdu 모로미ses 직 간사 직 말했어 균 직이네야 간사 직 말 되는 소소 타대바 임비 직둥 지식이 세메리 발라 깨징하시 소소 타대본 곤송바 리번 거바 인지 된덤을 되는 거바 용기 되면오스.
So if you think about this reasoning, you think about it again and again, this form of reasoning will make you kind of be a sharp or a smart person. So it's kind of a sharp, smart reasoning. And the more you think of such powerful reasons, the more smart you can become. So looking at the commentary to this verse, it says, in answering this argument, let's read through the argument again. If one would not wonder in this life whether one could experience suffering in the latter life, then one would have to experience sufferings in the latter life. It is therefore appropriate to make an effort to prevent that situation. The answer to that is the conceptual thought, thinking that the self of this life experiences suffering in the latter life is distorted. This would be like a dead person that takes rebirth in another person in a latter life. This latter person is not suitable to be the same as the earlier person. So we do go on and take another rebirth on the basis of a certain continuum. This was the refutation of the unsuitability of one to eliminate the suffering of another with the reasoning of the similarity of the earlier and latter different moments. The meaning of the text is not that it is a refutation based on the ultimate.
십자직 지기여서리 따지다 된덤을 되는 거 보숑기 되면 오세티 비 강사 직 마힘바 쌈기 아니 동할 세와 탄들랭고 매바이나 아니 깨징 하시 소소 타대바디 강사 직 책임은 도와스 인자 딘디군 공송 그리베게 아니 캐랑기 쟁기 동하세 무고 냠비고 로도든 거기 여마도 된덤을 되는 거 봐. 아니 존디 테마레스.
Here the author of the text says the meaning of the text is not that it is a refutation based on the ultimate. So if you have certain doubts that could make you wrongly understand the meaning of Shantideva here, then the commentary says the meaning of the text is not that it is a refutation based on the ultimate. So here, when we think of a person going from one lifetime to the next and considering the suffering that are experienced by the future person, whether they're the suffering of the person of this particular life, then just a second, I blacked out. Kazakh. 경아치 미치바 양케 소나.
디 깨징 하시니 뭐디? 아니 직 말아왔어. 라. 아니 직 마임 비균 생기 아니 란다 셴니 뭐디 직 마임 비균 생기 바좀에 동할 세야디 삼고가 매바이나 아니 깨징 하시니 뭐디 직 차금도 왔어. 아니 동하세 먹어 타용 곤송 그리방 그거였어.
So if you think that, for example, if you think that the previous moment and the latter moment are not the same, and it is similar to one is not the same or is not one with others, and therefore you don't need to do anything in order to dispel the suffering of the person that you will be in the future, as the person that you will be in the future will be a person that is other than you. Well, here Shantideva says this is not refuting it's not refuting an argument with respect to the ultimate. It says here, this meaning of the text is not that it is a refutation based on the ultimate.
된담로 되는 거고 성기 되면은 세 저거는 지금 로여라 된담로 되세 된담디 된담 덴발라 자르두면도 자리기 말에 인치나 된담 덴바 말아 어디다
저선 된담도 말람 맞아와인데 디 코어칸도 질는 거래
된담 봐서 오늘 자네기 니기 페나 랭에 바사샤비기 제부디 깨워치만 이용고요라 이용 무고에 라고 말했어 된당 오늘라 니 사비 레 나면디 이용고 거랬어 이내야 체디 단디 캐버도 치비기 아니 미디 아니 마녀네야 이용고 그랬어 당하다 체디 캐버시 나니래야 캐버시하진 된당만 이용 무고에 두고요 말했어 된당만 오늘 자네 이용고 그랬어 오늘 전에 세 된담 세야 돼. 오늘 전에 아니 비게 내가 고고요 말했어. 오늘 전에 용 무고요 고고요 말했어.
All right. So I found this section a little bit confusing. So I'll ask Geshe like a couple of questions with respect to that. Let's try to clarify some of the confusion. It says, this was a refutation of the unsuitability of one to eliminate the suffering of another with the reasoning of the similarity of the earlier and latter different moments. The meaning of the text is not that it is a refutation based on the ultimate. Now, often we take the ultimate to be ultimate truth, right? So here, the ultimate does not mean ultimate truth. The question is, what then does the word ultimate do here? What does it indicate? So we accept that we go from this lifetime to the next, right? The negative actions that I create in this life will result in suffering in future lifetimes, right? This is something that we accept. So the person creating actions or negativities in this life will experience the result of those negative actions in the future. We don't refute that. What we are refuting is that the future person of next life will be experiencing the suffering of the person of this life. So when we're refuting that the person of next life will experience the suffering of the person that we are in this life, it's not that we refute a person experiencing the results of their actions. Ultimately, they will experience the result of their actions. If they perform negative actions in this life, they will, a person will experience the result of that in future lifetimes. But if they do not, a person of future life does not experience the suffering of the person of this life.
This gonyok buroji. Takab golayangan this gonyok buroji yona ani lelaw mundo samsung ki sochi legirasra.
So we find this to be complicated, right? When we find this line of argumentation to be complicated, we can then understand that this practice or the reasoning used in this practice are not easy at all.
The nibadi delicacer rolata, kanse kangi dungar kan, ten teni gisona, kambi dungar lavem, jishiten tesonchas.
The next verse, number 99, says, if whenever there is suffering, that itself must protect from that. The suffering of the foot is not that of the hand. Why then does it protect from that?
The land jagorada, land kajarsana, and Jengi dunga di ninyo go mevanza, ni di sayagi tolaya, and beba chigoya mundu seti. 쟁기 동아들이야 님 배바 가르친 치고 말스나 쟁기 동아디 니뇽고 문도색 아니 어디게 아니 가서다 텔야 랭갸고레스 티임바이나 케란 깜베 동아 세약 쳇도 아니 라베 송교 치미리와타 라바다 깜바니 로가 임치르세
The next verse, number 99, makes it even clearer. So you might be thinking that since I'm the person of the present, am not experiencing the suffering of the future person, which means the other, I'm not experiencing the suffering of the other. I don't need to do anything about it. I don't need to protect the future person from suffering because they are other. So here Shantideva says that if you use this form of reasoning, it means that you do not need to use your hands in order to remove the suffering that you might be, the pain, sorry, that you might be experiencing in your foot. Since your hands and foot are other, you don't need to use your hand in order to remove the pain in your leg or in your foot.
양 관계체 차 관계 동할 관계 같은 류기차 대니기 송시 설거나 설마수보다비 감비 동할 라비 멤베 지셔 라바티네 감비 동할데 송차 메리바탈로스.
The commentary says, further, when one part of the body needs to eliminate the suffering of another body part and protect that body part, since the suffering of the foot, pain by a thorn, is not the suffering of the hand, why should the hand eliminate the suffering of the foot? It would follow that it is unsuitable.
다드니 다 양자 디기 야 렌소로치 가디 리밤 미얀드스 다돈 잠빈 죽제나 다제 메리 칸이 디치니 반 판제니스.
The next verse continues with that. It says, if though unsuitable, here it engages due to grasping itself. This unsuitable self and other, what can they do? They are to be abandoned.
제다 데레다 오네 캐랑 라바나 신로 송거다 캐랑 라바나 오네 그 비길이야 직비 째바이나 아니 개발 치야지 문두데 개발치는 죽지바지 문두데나야 아니 베다 당진기 왕기 아니 개발디 치기여서로 지바이나 디 다제 메리카인데스 다다 신 릭스비 치비다 당진다 당진라 소바디 넘버 탐제도 방자레스 도르고르스 방고그레스.
근데 가지기 갈라기요래.
가지기 오늘 제버친 답이 다 14부 섬담바이나 다진 아니 피게 셴기 동아디 세워지 셴기 동아 가즈랑기 동아 세워지 셴기 동아 델이야 아니 쿠르만라와디 직문투스 이나야 당진다 당진가 왕기 디치기여로지 라바이나스. 대 당진다 당진세 가드나 방과야지레스. 디원도 중닝 말세 티처레스.
So here in verse 100, someone might say that taking care of one's own suffering, eliminating one's own suffering and not doing so for the sake of others is not at all right. But still one does that because of grasping at the self. So the answer to that is that grasping at the self, grasping at eternity, is always something, or there are always something that need to be abandoned.
디는 저자는 로스장 가딘 제메기 동할 지슈기 세와 리바미야스 제메기 리바미야 들 다도 좀바 콤발이 깨왕 하시다 치중 하루 치료라 소비 르남 간자 지부티 다그른 점바 공발에 지기 동안 지수기 세월은 죽지나스 다 당제왕 죽지나스 라오에 다단 젠도 점바 메리와 카임바테 진니반의 방월자와 니인데 간사기 다둔 점바 셴율을 추시 디 폰로 탐지 기비체로스.
Since that the commentary explains that in a way that is slightly different, even though it is inappropriate for one to eliminate unrelated suffering, here it is appropriate for one to eliminate the sufferings of the other because the bodies of the earlier and latter lives and earlier and latter moments of this body are all held by one person as mind due to familiarization. In answering that, it says, what can that unsuitability held as independent self and other accomplish? They are suitable to be abandoned because the grasping of the self of person is mistaken and generates all faults.
에다디 다 가사 간사가 다둔 점바 셴율을 추시 디 폰로 탐지 기비체로 세야디 먼저 다른 전 참여난 송고야 남기 치식 풍분 지여바 대식 telang안지여 안지여나 양네디 텔레야니 기와인세 당지 여친절이야 아니 차당기 그레스 차당기 위차유젤라 아니 차당강기 레사 그레스 레디 왕기다 동한용 동아 규미체도 용하디 용거레스자 자원 타도바디 당질라 투여를 손대야 디다 디다 찍어 송거레스라
렌치장기도 직탐보데
치식 풍분지여바.
So the Nagarjuna's Ratnavali, Precious Garland, says that so long as you grasp at the aggregate, for that long you would grasp at the self. So long as you grasp at the self, you will still accumulate actions that will result in birth. So long as we grasp at the self, for that long, we will experience suffering.
다 asomba dagjin nyambo gom murungwi murung nyambi keg servanis teni munsong de kanza soso jemme yenla kanza chigi kanla choba chigi genjun da tsenga shin gyun chigba yembe chimma la chigi dongar chisho gi sewa rigla hama ten merisu shena astang hama kanza pegi jemme ni di 라 캐나다 나다위기 니 캐랑 동가 탄들레 야다 캐랑 니 동가 탄들레야세 디고 데메르와스 티 최고의 문도와스 다 gyung하시다 깨징하시슬라바이나 gyung치기 차네 아니 비 따지 콜라야 드와지도와스 니 드라그먼도 슬라바이나 슬라거다.
Then point C comes at the heading of dispelling the hindrances or objections to thinking that it is unsuitable to meditate on the equality of self and others. So someone might say that it is unsuitable to meditate on the equality of self with others because, to begin with, self and others are unrelated to each other. That's different to the case of a person belonging to one continuum. So when we think of the person in this life going to the next lifetime, the person belongs to the same continuum. And therefore, it is not the same as the person that is me, myself, and the person and another person, which are unrelated.
가딜라야 균당 속시 차원이 팀원 말라 속신 준 동하 쟁간 테메바
In presenting the argument here, it says the two situations are not the same as two different people are unrelated, but the hands and feet of one person belong to the same group, and the old and young person and the earlier and latter life belong to the same continuum. In the latter situation, it is appropriate for one to help the other, but in the first situation, just self and other being different people, it is inappropriate. So to answer that, verse 101 says, That called continuum and collection are like falsities, such as a rosary and an army. The possessor of suffering does not exist. Who has control over this?
다들이다 균치보다 속바직세디 비길야지 준비기 취지레마도 된탐바튼 유딩니 비기 속바직다 균치보세지 주요 말레스 로 테메반자 디 안리아 딜라 원와르세 디 레세 비 된딩니 주바직 요 말레스 따주디 다 가르소다 따주도 줌바레스.
Here Shantideva says that a continuum and collection of falsities. As they are falsities, they are not established as ultimate. So taking them to be established as ultimate is a mistake.
네, 베나다 균직보다 속바직보세디 아니 가서다 군줍기 조수지레마도 아니 유코랭딩니 아니 요수직 마레스 틴자 안디기 렌티기 타칸지 렌테기 문둘라거다.
A collection is a conventionality, which means that a collection does not exist objectively. And since a collection does not exist objectively, here the argument that is put forward is not right.
제 베나 라마위 균단 소바에 메바타 균단 소바시자와니 팀원다 말라소바 랑기 차도 말라따비 좀바 임바신드 규진 하시 도마다 소바젠 따니 샤비 좀바 임비처스.
In answering this argument, it says it follows there is no independent group or continuum because that called continuum and group are falsities labeled on the earlier and latter parts of that possessing the continuity and on the parts of the group, like the rosary and the army that are falsely labeled on their different parts.
Kansa chigi dagi yuduba kansa di wan göja yimbe yudu ta dejan chigi dongar chikshogi selo sena dongar chingi kansa ki da kanyimba te mebishir kansa rawa ti dedung di sushik on gyur suya wan göja mayimbar sonsos.
Let's look at the following argument. Since they are contained in the mind of one person, they fall under the control of that person, and therefore, even though they are different from the point of view of object and time, the suffering of one is eliminated by the suffering of the other. To answer this argument, it says because there is no self of the person that is suffering, there is also no happiness or suffering that is controlled by any controller. For this reason, there is no independent possessor engaging suffering, and hence all sufferings of self and others have no distinction. However, there is the suffering of self and other who are nominally dependent on each other, and therefore it is appropriate to eliminate one's suffering.
Redabena Tiwans Lavna Max Lavna Pigi Karso Daji Sobalaya Taksam Remado Anichi Pat Zevaina Penantan Tinga Anzuta Managing Tinga Dangi Sag Tinga di Anichi Lonta dan Tindo da to Spachi Zevaina Tingan Dirisagi Mundoas Pigi Taksam Ra Taksam Dindes da Max Signidia the Dinaji Kanji Chukanjina Kanji Pigilaya Taksamado Yudini Mebainza any Randa Shengi Dungarsini Rangi Dungarsin bit any Suzula Yape any Rambashi Yuda Shensla the bed and Jemmy in Java Tindiji Sawani Yomars Kansana Rans and Ngadia Shanla Taksamni Nash Shagor Mado Shanla Madubigi and it's Narawajik yo marwas tinza timena tela tembi ni dungar seagi ani rama dungar chik ta sorgyo mares kanji dinza ani ditsamalo dangzon ani chik rangjinzin di wangi ani kaso ta chik 총대하지 레마도 딥 매바이나 아니 참만 찬념이 바지 직규리 바지 샤그레 순고서다
So thinking of collections such as rosary and army, these collections are imputed in depends upon rosary and army are phenomena that are imputed in depends upon a collection. So for example, looking at the rosary, it is imputed in depends upon the collection. And when you look for rosary within the members of the collection, such as, for example, the individual beads, the main bead and so forth, the rosary is not found within those beads, and therefore a rosary does not exist objectively. So looking at oneself or one's own suffering, we grasp it, one's own suffering as to be the suffering of someone that exists completely onto themselves, as if there is an independent self here, and there are others that are unrelated to that suffering individual. But this is not the case, because self can only exist in relation to others. Self does not exist independently from others onto themselves, but they exist in relation to others. And therefore, there is no independent experiencer of suffering. And yet, in our mind, we still apprehend that experience of suffering that is we ourselves, as if we exist completely onto ourselves, as if we are one discrete entity that is separated or unrelated to others. And such apprehension arises due to self-cherishing. But then when you take out self-cherishing of that, you come to see that all of us are equal in terms of experiencing suffering.
제 동할 다보 매반니 탐제 제라 매반니스 동할 뇽보 다 라완드 매바인자 라 비기게 따지 되네 딱자마도 동할 뇽보 다 아니 라완드 매바인자 아니 뇽규 동할라야 비기 이와 체치니 란다 셴기 동할스니 파 이와 체자와지 yo maris kansa nyong bu da de la ya ani chi rang da shen sin pi gi ani rawang du yo ba chi mundu was nyong bu da de la me na nyong gi dunga de la ya chera chi yo me ba di chi ba res.
Verse 102 continues in saying, the honor of suffering being non-existent, there can be no distinction at all, sorry. So these two lines say that the self, that is the experience of suffering, does not exist independently. They are merely imputed. So the honor of suffering being non-existent, which means an independent experiencer of suffering, does not exist. There can be no distinction at all in terms of the experiences of suffering. So the self is one that experiences suffering, and others which experience suffering are not different at all. They are the same.
Di sigoma dia nyamdlena peyagoser tamje cheda mebani dungar yinshi teser chas ra kanzna tinza pigi dunga nyombu dalaya rawang du meba inza nyongyu dungar ya randa shengi dungar seni pigi ani rawang troba chik tsawani yo maris te meba inza dungar yimba gyunseng tarangi ani sel goya chik ro rangjing dunga ye ma cheba tagarang se goya chik chagores dunga yinshi tesel chase.
So although in terms of the outline, the first two lines in verse 102 are explained separately from the next point, which gives us a synopsis, which covers 6 lines, beginning with the last 2 lines in verse 102. In some sense, it's nice to read them together, because when you say that there can be no distinction at all, because it is suffering, I shall dispel it. Since self and others do not exist objectively, self is merely imputed, and others are merely imputed. Since there is no distinction at all, both self and others experience sufferings, and both self and others are not independent, not objective. Because it is suffering, I shall dispel it.
The sajay ngibi ani chiksho selgu chiksho sel mugu samde deagi samlo digi karchi kors chishik chase ra dunga yinse tesaja ngibin den chishik chas ngibin den chishik chas ani sholuka bi gyad niti ani chamaya nyamdu robayna.
And since there is no difference between the experience of suffering in not existing objectively, both self and others, those who experience suffering, are merely imputed and depends upon others. Since there is no difference, since it is suffering, since they are suffering, you think, I shall dispel that. When we read through the first 2 lines the last 2 lines in verse 102, it says, because it is suffering, I shall dispel it. Therefore, what is the point in that?
Gyunzen tenas dongal longjebi rawi dagbo meba donga nyombo rawi donga nyombo ji meba ni dagdan shingi donga tamji chera meba nyilas ra tanyin du penzu tebe dagjin tedagi donga yang yobe rangi donga sevala bevrigsos kanji rangi nigi donga sevala ya bevrigres.
Looking at the commentary to this section, let's read through the argument again. It says, since they are contained by the mind of one person, they fall under the control of that person, and therefore, even though they're different from the point of view of object and time, the suffering of one is eliminated by the suffering of the other. The answer says, because there is no self of the person that is suffering, there is also no happiness or suffering that is controlled by any controller. For this reason, there is no independent possessor engaging suffering, and hence all suffering of self and others have no distinction. However, there is the suffering of self and other who are nominally dependent on each other, and therefore it is appropriate to eliminate one's suffering.
Ta gyunzen tena gwanda tiri andiri ta dhendowa di tsawa di gyada somdi pa jarna peshi chi shir kungi donghar ni dogbar chashi tsaldu me kade dogna tamje do teme dajan simjen shins.
So in explaining the reasons why it is reasonable to meditate on such equation, we looked at the extensive explanation, and now we come to the synopsis. We've covered the last 2 lines in verse 102. Let's look at verse 103 that says, beginning with an objection, why should I avert the suffering of all? The response, there is no ground for argument. If I avert it, I should avert it. If not, I'm just like sentient beings.
Ta ten duondi karesana donghar yimbi gyunzen ji saya remado pena rangi donghar segoya gyunzen di ko donghar yimbi gyunzen ji saya remado shemba gyunzen kanyo maris ta donghar yimbi gyunzen ji saya ina jengi donga dia donga rewas sego rewas ta di mayim bigi ani rangi donghar segoya da shengi donga se mugubi gyunzen yanda chi tsawa yin mandus samdansa mandus tadi.
When you think of this, the summary of that, since it is suffering, I should dispel it. be it the suffering of oneself or the suffering of others. Since it is suffering, I should dispel it. If you think that I don't have to do it because it is other suffering, and other suffering is not my suffering. Here, Shantideva says that this reason does not work at all. The basic argument here is that because it is suffering, I should dispel it.
Then it's the Devadi Jil Award that the Penashengi Dunga Dana Dunga in Bicher, the rank is our chawa, Rigi, Randashin, Riks Chipping, about Ter, Nichishicha, Jengi Donganta, the Sergu, Chisher, some Jenkungi Dungan, Dala Munebi, Chisher, Dobachash, Sel to Maybe, Rangi, Dungar, Torja, Maimbe, Kede, Donaya, Dongatam, Doba Rila, Jengi Dungar Savadimena, Dagi Dungajan, some Jensi Dungajendo, Saja Maiba, Give. Dala Cheban Zinshendo, Jencheba Soni, T. Dungar Sevala, Checher Beba Chaos.
The commentary to verse 103 says, therefore, because the suffering of others is suffering, it is suitable to be eliminated by me. What use is the concrete division into self and other? Since one needs to eliminate all the suffering of others, there is no argument like, since it does not harm me, why should one reverse the suffering of others? If one reverses one's suffering because one does not desire them, then it is appropriate to reverse the suffering of everybody. If the sufferings of others are not to be eliminated, then one's own suffering also becomes something not to be eliminated, like the sufferings of others. Hence, one should put great importance into eliminating the sufferings of others by cherishing others as one cherishes oneself.
Tirida, the Kanji Tusum Shiadita, Dungar Slaundi, Dunga Slaundi, Pigi, the Niger receives on the Chagdosra, Niger in Baina, Kaduna Mugoajrata, Pena Zumba in Baina, Zin in Baina, Kaduna Zuri Modoko, Demba Chajomara, Zina, Rangishana Zuri, Shankishana Zuri, Kaduna Mugoaj Chagras. These are Dungardi, Niger in Rana in a Mugoa. Jela in the Mugoa, could Niger was Pena Dryna, Rangi Dryna, Jengi Dryna, could Draros, dressing into Suchiki Menderos. Tinza Kadunas and Selgoyage, Dungaina Kaduna Selgoyage, Ranching Cabot Majib, Dungatam just said, Town the language, Korangi, Muyunis Chagores.
Suffering is a hammer, something that harms. So since it is something that harms, it needs to be dispelled. It's just like saying that, for example, if it's a lie, if it's a falsity, it will always be a falsity. Regardless if the speaker of that falsity is self or other, a falsity is always a falsity. It does not become true relative to the person speaking it. So the same thing can apply to suffering. If it's suffering, it is a hammer. Doesn't matter if it harms oneself or harms others. If it is suffering, it is something that harms. Similarly, you could say that if there is an enemy, it is the same as being enemy, either in relation to oneself or in relation to others. So, and therefore an enemy, since an enemy is the same, then an enemy needs to be opposed or overcome. So anyway, here the argument that is used is saying that since suffering is something that harms, it is an agent of harm, it needs to be dispelled. And therefore we take upon ourselves the responsibility of dispelling suffering because it is suffering.
Sumba Zoba Bongola Ni Sonja, Sumba Zoba Bongola Ni, Zoba Karzoga Sanda, Simjingi Dongar Sambe, Simjing Dongar Sambe, Chanju Samba Rani, Donga de Shan Kurgoya Mondoa Sag. And Dilagorada. Tindi Samya di Tegmaris. 심진기 동할 삼니 잔주 셈바 동할기 자원디 큐르요 마레스 아 동할 삼비 고바요레스 라 동할 삼비 고바 담보 심진기 동할 삼비 찬섬 라니 동할기 자원디 큐와 메데바니 닌지 동할 망규비 지셰 nengi 깨체나 드위 동할 삼치나 제달 닌지 동할 망스
Let's look at the last point in explaining the reasons why it is reasonable to meditate on such an equation. And the last section is abandoning objection. So the first objection says that it is not valid to say that the Bodhisattva himself falls prey to suffering by reflecting on the suffering of sentient beings. So someone might say that it is not suitable for Bodhisattvas to think of the suffering of others, because if they think of the suffering of others, they will come under the control of that suffering, and therefore they ought not to do it. So here, the answer, of course, is that this argument is not valid. Now, looking at verse 104, objection, since compassion will multiply suffering greatly, why should I diligently develop it? The response, if one were to contemplate the suffering of migrating beings, how could the suffering of compassion be more?
총어디 가지디게 아니 잔주 삼번 속에 심진기 동할 삼니 아니 쇼지 동할 용대야 지 설거서라서라 다 심진기 동할 삼니 닌지 기용용디 닌지 기여마도 소 동할 용구여서 말아서라.
So someone might say that when bodhisattvas think of others, they come to suffer greatly. So the answer here is that when bodhisattvas think of the suffering of others, they develop compassion. In no way it causes them pain.
얘네야 초등아 기기여서 말이스라 먼저 민니 치마 쇼바 잠지기 초등아 예빙 예보면도 슈지 가위칼이야 민니 치마 쇼에 되는 용거도 왔어 아니 슈지 된 대박기 칼이야 민니 치마 쇼에 되는 용거라서 초등아 기고 말았어 잔주선 비심진 그 동아 삼니 닌지 숙진 기온디 아니 다 루그 바보당한다 민니 치마 쇼에디
So when bodhisattvas develop, when bodhisattvas consider the pain of the sufferings of others, and through that they develop compassion, in no way it gives them sensations of pain. So sometimes you see, for example, that through meditating on compassion, one's hair on one's body stand on end and tears naturally flow down. So if that happens, if tears flow down and the hair of one's body stand on end, or you get goosebumps or whatever, doesn't mean that you necessarily experience painful sensation. It's not necessarily that you have a painful sensation, because thinking of compassion, for example, or generating compassion, and tears begin to flow down could be a sign of being completely taken by compassion, developing great delight in compassion, finding inspiration to the point in which you get goosebumps and so forth. So it is not equated with having a painful sensation.
난주길에다 닌지 초그려와지 세와 초그려와줘라 대단 닌지 전부 니디 잔주 셈비기 닌지 니모데 베드 로가레도스라 난주 닌지디 피기 착받은 제비기 닌지 차와인자 아니 닌지 디왕기 수수 셈 마기와 용야지 수수래야 둥한테야지 용거라서라 닌라 수기야지 어디 아니 착바다 되기요 반자 아 피 초리와지 인반자 아니 둥아 끼고서 간지 착바다 되고는자 아니 둥아 연구여서레스라 잔주스 비닌지디 균신 뎀비 닌지 초리 메비 닌지 진반자 가주 닌지 끼바 티속이 아니 로트 짐바지마도 아니 샘슝 파레지마도 비게 아니 지 샘슝 바다 아니 지 마기바 용야세디 싸워니니여서 말이스.
But then we have a limited version of compassion in that we have partial love or partial compassion to others. And when we say that we have partial love and compassion to others, it means that our extension of love, our extending of love and care and compassion to others is mixed up with attachment. And when it is mixed up with attachment, it gives us problems. It creates pain in our heart. Since it is together with attachment, we do sometimes experience problems or pain when we develop compassion or concern for others. But for bodhisattvas, it's different because their love and compassion to others are not partial. They're not partial, and therefore, the more they develop on, the more they meditate on the suffering of others, they become more determined, more courageous to dispel the suffering of others. In no way they become unhappy. In no way do they lose courage.
가디 닌지 신기 동아 탐제 다크리 체나 동아 망본 기르 지시 동아 무봉와 nengi 동아 계체나스 chanchu sembi droyu 동아 삼바 체나 제달 닌지 왕기 동아 망본 조 많이 바타 대 랑기 초 동아 타다 세비셔.
The argument in verse 104 says, if out of compassion one makes all the suffering of others one's own, then one's suffering become more. Why generate suffering with intensity instead of abandoning it? The answer is, when bodhisattvas contemplate the suffering of migrators, it follows that the suffering does not increase due to compassion, because this compassion eliminates all their feelings of suffering. So how do bodhisattvas not being brought down or dragged down by this massive suffering of others? Since that the suffering of others are mammoth, kind of, it's like a huge contemplation. So how does it not bring them down? Yeah. Ila shengi dungnel dende gyachyo imbaina. Tan chanchi sempaten so sengi dungnel ila mashowa kandechi chagimares. Tadi sengi dungel den de shukchembo rikmambo gyacha de sanotawa inarwa sem mashoya de kandechi chagres
간스나 콜리야 덴타메바 그 짜와 좀바 임바디 소르고요 반자
카르좀
동할 짜와디 좀바 임바 로 덴바 메바디 통구요 반자 로드 끼거레스 세약 니바요 바디 셀 투약이 탑요 바디 통구요 반자 가주스 갸침부 요바이냐 로 심구요 말레스.
Bodhisattvas say that the root of suffering is a falsity. It is not true. Since they say that the root of suffering is a falsity, they know that it can be dispelled. Since they know that it is possible to dispel suffering because its root is a falsity, it is not true, they do not lose heart. They actually become courageous because they see that there is a way of eliminating suffering. Is it because at that point they conjoin bodhicitta and emptiness? Chezan kanan la di kabdila chanchugi sentan toni topelo di sundre chene gomgerves.
Yes.
Yes.
shukchegda sara deningonne shukchembuta chanjugu semda pigi tomban인다 chanjugu semni고 고와디 다 직로 찍려야 로토야 레바이나 되니 다 가르무 가르 가둑 태바이나 빼디 아니 직 니투 말이 삼성기 심바디 자원인이 연구해서 말했다.
Yes, if we combine bodhicitta together with emptiness, there would be no point in which we'll become discouraged in thinking that I cannot do that. Such sense of discouragement will not arise when we develop that powerful combination of emptiness and bodhicitta. Wenju? Ken, sorry, I can't hear you. It is not counteracted by? All right. So if you haven't developed a realization of emptiness and you only meditate on bodhicitta, it seems that sometimes the power of bodhicitta could be too strong because it's not counteracted by emptiness. Ta halam Quran karesam gyoresena halam kesi chanjugisem chikpo gombaina tonitawa magoena matowaina yamena koachik mena nis sansan chanjugisem shutane tende chagres shukta sadi ta toni tawanyamdo sunduma chawaina peshi mantayana shukta chagres tende chilayorbes
덴딜라요 말을 다 덴데 여기 말에 이나야 돈이 기타베 촉 마셔봐나 까까블야 잔주그 셈 냠이야 되는 용도 왔어. 라 잔주그 셈 끼니 잔주그 셈 냠정에 덴디 용구 여러 왔어. 라
Well, Geshe reckons that it's not that you'll have bodhicitta that is too strong. It's rather that sometimes when bodhicitta is not conjoined with emptiness, it is possible that bodhicitta will decline.
too strong said 차에서 말하더라. 가지 탐에도 배워야자. 아, 공부 탐에도 배워야자. 아니 디여서 말했어.
Well, Geshe reckons that you cannot say that bodhicitta will become too strong because actually we can develop bodhicitta to an utmost unlimited extent. It doesn't have any limits. Bodhicitta doesn't have any limit. Okay. So Jason says that what he meant is that without the view of emptiness, if you cultivate bodhicitta, it might sometimes appear as if the suffering of others inherently exists or truly exists. So that could be, so that's what Jason takes to be kind of when bodhicitta becomes too strong, kind of seeing suffering to be an inherently existing suffering. Chezan Quran dito la sano tama inarwa, chanchu gisen shutane la di kesi tonita wa sundre machewa ina. Dunga sa di ranshingi drube dunga naegi nyanga chik dusa. Chezan chanchu gisen kena ya shengi dunga di demba drube dunga ranshingi drube dunga dende nayons.
야고도 저는 선수 네 간단한 셀기에서 더 셀기에서 들었다. 투스트는 셀기에 잔주구셈 셀기에서디 요 말이지. 잔주구셈 가주스 공부를 좀 알이야. 텔리에 세요 말았어. 셀기에나 세지 고그러스. 텔기에서 디요 말았어. 단데 제가 나왔나지 돈이 있다와래 균이 성로 마다니 잔주스님 찍고 공부했나 땡땡 동하디 비게 따지 뎀버트버다 나니 따지 간점질라 이탕치에서로 시키 아 당이 용사 말했어 아니 잔주스님 냐야딘 땡땡 용쓰기 얘기랬어.
It's a good point that you've made, Jason, because first of all, just looking at the way that we express that, if we say that, for example, bodhicitta could become too strong, it might imply that you could overemphasize bodhicitta in that kind of there's certain limits that you should develop bodhicitta to, but then you might exceed that. You might go over the limit in terms of, or over the top in terms of cultivating bodhicitta, whereas actually there is no upper limit to the development of bodhicitta. It can be developed limitlessly. But still, what could occur, in relation to the point that you've made, it could be that without combining it with emptiness, that suffering will appear to you to be truly existing suffering. And when you meditate on that for a long duration, it could make you tired. You might become deflated, and then it could make bodhicitta decline. That could happen if the cultivation of bodhicitta is not conjoined with the cultivation of the view of emptiness.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's do some dedications. Gewadi nyududa lama sangye drugyune drowa chikyama lupa de sala gopa sho chanchu semchu rinpoche maje banan ki yurji gewa nyamba mebayang gone gondu pewa sho kangri rawe kowe shingamdi pendan dewa malu jungwe ne chenre ziwan tenzin gyatso i shape side pardu ten yuru chi Son jube lam cheche sewe kanchen ten jungun chana pemo ten singyan sola sowa de so shendun lu sho tu tsu chanchin jangun yawe ten zingyon pewe kunzo do po tse Chosun kowe le mun tu du pa da so du je kon du shak ten sho. Thank you.